Very good evening and welcome. You're watching the India Development Debate with me, Tamanna Inamdar. All eyes and all focus on the excitement of G20 this week, with more than 200 meetings and an unprecedented year of multilateral diplomacy. The G20 Leaders Summit will culminate this weekend as heads of states meet to discuss issues related to economy, geopolitics, social equality, welfare and climate. Later this year, when leaders among Joe Biden, Rishi Sunak, Emmanuel Macron meet Prime Minister Modi, India will once again tread the tightrope of international diplomacy. As India continues to buy Russian oil and remains a prominent member of the Quad, fends of Chinese advances at the border and stays part of BRICS, the G20 meet will yet again test India's actions and their implications and how it stands in the world. The other big absence which is being talked about, of course, is of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, who will not be joining G20. The Chinese Prime Minister, though, will be coming in. But there are many challenges in front of the world and this G20 bloc. The biggest one, of course, is will these countries rise above their internal differences to really do something about the challenges that the globe faces? What are the business opportunities that can emerge from G20, and how do we make sure that this opportunity is not wasted? We'll also talk about what India's role will be. But before we get into that conversation, just a few glimpses of all the prep in the national capital for the big G20 meet.
Atithi Devo Bhava. These are not just the three words, but the true emotion which will reflect in India's hospitality. Delhi NCR hotels, they are all geared up. They are all set to welcome foreign delegation. Those are coming for G20 Global Leaders Summit. Right now, we are standing here in Hotel Taj Palace, SP Marg. And over here as well, a traditional, Indian traditional theme that has been captured, and that will be reflected when they will be welcoming the foreign guest. Let me show you this thali. That is also designed on the theme of peacock. So this has got the beautiful peacock feathers you can see. Now this is a silk stole that will be given to foreign delegates. The Odisha craftsmen, they have prepared this stole, and local for global. That is the theme that will be reflected as well.
Everything would be very local, so to say. And, whether it's food, whether it's the small takeaway gifts or whatever it is, we will be doing, showcasing every part of India. So like the stalls that you see at the background, these are going to be used for the welcome, which are ikatkari stalls. This has been done by local artisans. So these are the kind of, and the menu that has been prepared by the chefs, which is bearing in mind the millet of the year. The whole theme has been done on that.
So what can this year's G20 meet achieve at a time which is particularly tricky and the world seems more divided than ever? To speak more on this, I'm joined now by Gautam Chikarmane, Vice President of ORF, Jayan Das Gupta, former Ambassador and Representative of India to WTO, Suhasini Haider, Diplomatic Editor, The Hindu, is joining us on the show. Welcome to all of you and thank you so much for joining us. Suhasini, let me just start by getting your take on what we can expect. A lot of chatter about Putin not coming in, Xi Jinping not coming in. I mean, Putin was widely expected. He's barely traveled anywhere after the war that he started on Ukraine. Do you think this really makes a big difference as it's being touted to be?
Well, I think the real question, and there are three basically heads of government, heads of state who aren't coming themselves. One is the president of Russia, the president of China, and then the president of Mexico, President Obrador, who does not go to G20s at all. So he hasn't gone to any of those since he's been elected. I think where it makes a difference is the idea that if India is to be the balancing force between the East and the West, the global North and the global South, then a sizable chunk of that, i.e. Russia and China, are not going to be represented at the leadership level. If the issues weren't as fractious as they are in this last week before the G20, it possibly wouldn't have mattered at all, and particularly since President Xi Jinping of China will be represented by his premier, Li Qiang. The real problem is that as the Sherpa meeting gets underway, and it has been on the outskirts of Delhi since yesterday, any issues that are left up to the leaders to try and sort out, particularly on Ukraine, on things like climate financing, on things like global climate deadlines, issues where you are seeing a lot of differences between the global south and the developing world and the developed world of the G7, it would have been much easier to try and forge some kind of a consensus if all the leaders were there themselves. Their absence certainly will be felt in that sense. It also perhaps takes away a little bit of the news excitement over having those two leaders who have so many issues with so many of the other members of the G20 there. But I think in the long run, as you said, President Putin was not really expected to attend. President Xi Jinping may have been a surprise, but given the state of India-China bilateral ties, perhaps not such a surprise.
Yeah, and the fact is that the world is a more acrimonious place since the last several months, with or without the G20 or India's specific presidency of G20. This is more symptomatic of what we're seeing in the world right now. And let me come to you on that point, Gautam Chikarmane. Also makes it more challenging to get something substantial out of this meet. I mean, of course, very prestigious, superb that all the top leaders of the world are congregating in India. I'm sure we will be fantastic hosts. But if we are hoping for a substantial leader declaration at a time when there are so much, when it's so fractious, would that be overestimating what will come out of this?
The Leaders' Declaration used to be a very important document earlier, but I think ever since China has gone rogue, we are not expecting too much from this document. So China will always try to do its own little thing and try to humiliate the host, etc. So I'm not surprised by the actions of China, nor am I surprised by the actions of Russia. Both are, of course, and that's where the divide in G20 really is. But as far as the job of G20 is to act like the board of directors of the global board of directors of the global economy. And I find that for a long time, ever since the second summit, which is the London summit in April 2009, they've been adding new ideas into this and sort of burdening G20 with issues that do not belong to G20. For instance, green and sustainable recovery, climate change, Millennium Development Goals in Seoul Summit, Brisbane Summit talked about the outbreak of Ebola, Antalya Summit talked about terrorism, etc. I think all these things are happening because the organization that has some form of a legitimacy, which is the United Nations, is failing. So as a result, every country is trying to add new things into the basket of G20. What India has done, and what I would absolutely want to point out, is that it has brought geopolitics, it has brought international relations from the high table to the dining table of households. There are more than 12,000 delegates. They have gone to 60 cities in 28 states. There are more than 150 cultural events. Every city, people are talking about G20. I found that to be an overmuch, by the way. I thought that this was a distraction. I thought this fun and games is not the place. G20 is not the place for such fun and games. But what I'm now realizing, and I'm therefore changing my opinion, is that actually it has made G20 very accessible. It has made it very inclusive. Every person on the street, on the road, everywhere is talking about
Mr.
G20.
Chikarmane, if I may come in, you're talking about which constituent? You're saying Indian people are excited about that's G20 right. And it's become mainstream.
Right. India is only one of several. Yeah. Now, if you look at India as the emerging voice of the global south, the inclusion, the potential inclusion of the African Union is a very big thing. And I think that's where inclusion goes beyond the geography of India and goes global. I think it is sad that a large continent like Africa has been kept out of these conversations. I think, therefore, India taking the role of the mantle of the leadership of the global south and including African Union, if it does happen, I'm not certain whether it will, but if it does, it will be a very big boost to the G20 in terms of the inclusivity of this organization.
In a world where most nations, and especially this has been made worse by COVID, when most nations have turned inward and are more inward looking. Bilaterals are becoming more in vogue. What's in it for me is the idea that most nations are taking forward. What difference is India making at this point? Jayant Dasgupta, I'm coming to you with that question. In terms of climate change financing, in terms of more parity in transfer of technology, in terms of doing something good for the world and the biggest challenges we face today, and extreme climate is definitely one of them. Can something come out which everyone can agree on? Whether it's a Russia, whether it's a China, is there enough ground to cover on other important stuff, keeping aside all the acrimony?
So just I think to make its presence felt and to take the leadership of the global south in this G20. In the last few days before the meeting commences on the 9th of September, the time is short. So we have to get some concrete outcomes out of the Sherpas meeting, which is to last till Thursday. Now, having said that, this problem of Ukraine-Russia is again having a huge overhang on all the discussions. A very substantive outcome will possibly not come out of this G20, but the highlight of this could be a common minimum program on, for instance, on financing, on taking forward the issue of WTO reforms, because without trade, the whole of growth of the world in terms of, and already there are headwinds, the WTO has projected only one. Against that backdrop, if at least we can rejuvenate the WTO, a constructive discussion on reforms, including the most important dispute settlement reforms, which the Americans have been stalling for the past 5-6 years. And if they agree to let the appellate body of the WTO function, then perhaps we can get the negotiating arm of the WTO also in action, and we can see new agreements negotiated, trade barriers getting lowered, and on the whole, trade opportunities, especially for the South, improving with this new initiative. So I think Prime Minister Modi, in all his discussions with the heads of state of important countries.
I want to come to Mr. Chikramani on that point. Where is that middle ground where we can actually get some stuff done, things which matter, alleviate more of this world out of poverty, make sure that there is some kind of security or a global action plan against erratic climatic conditions, climate financing, things like that. Do you think there is room for negotiation, and or does it make very little sense without a Russia, China, Mexico on board?
So I think the leaders' declarations in G20 are largely statements of intent. And I don't see any problem in getting those intentions on the table. Turning those intentions into action points, for instance, in climate finance, requires a different platform, and it is probably more of domestic platforms led by the United States and Europe than anywhere else. We have had several such organizations, and I think that execution will happen over there. At this moment, I'm not very optimistic about it, but you never know. There is one more point which is keeps coming. The elephants in the room are Russia and China, and how does the leaders' declaration balance all those things? I think what we are looking at is the breakage of a unipolar and a bipolar world into a multipolar world. And I think G20 under India is providing that multipolarity. I think it will be able to take all the interests, the conflicting interests into account, and it would be a big step if the statements of intent that happen preceding the actions on those intent are done. I don't see much of a problem, but if the West is hard saying that Russia needs to be condemned, and India says no, we are a neutral party and there is no need for that condemnation, at some point there will be a negotiation. And I don't, as far as I see it from this vantage point, at this point in time, at this moment, I don't see a Russia condemnation coming in the G20 summit, other than we want peace and there should be security, there should not be war. War is bad for trade, war is bad for citizens of the world, etc., etc. But we need to understand that the burden on India, the stress on India, the push on India is coming because of the breakage of the unipolar and a bipolar world into a multipolar, where India is providing that multipolarity.
Yep. Suhasini, the other question is about Ukraine, right? Trudeau saying that he's wondering why Mr. Zelensky has not been invited to Delhi. And India has done very well in that clear stance, balancing act or clear stance that we need to, so we'll buy Russian oil. We condemn violence and, the humanitarian crisis, but we're not going to get into the same blame game. Can we continue to do that?
Well, you see, one part of it is the leader statement. And as Gautam put it, at the end of the day, how much will the balancing India have to do on the statement itself? Not to get into too many of the technicalities, but the statement contains at present 2 paragraphs. It's right now what is called a holding paragraph. A placeholder has been put for what are called geopolitical issues. Geopolitical issues is really, in this case, simply Ukraine. 2 paragraphs that have been lifted from the Bali G20 summit. Now, those 2 paragraphs, it's interesting, Russia and China have an objection to the first paragraph that actually has that condemnation of Russia, quoting the UN General Assembly resolution from last year in that. The second paragraph, actually only China objects to. Russia does not object to that second paragraph, which basically says that in this world, we must move away from, we must not have aggression, must work away from loss of sovereignty, must maintain territorial integrity of countries, that kind of thing. Very bland, not pointedly at Russia. So now it's a question of that single paragraph from Ukraine and whether it can be rephrased to a point at which the G7 countries that have become a kind of bloc on this, because remember, the G20 is kind of divided 50-50 on this issue. It is the G7 and a few of their allies like Japan and the rest, like Australia and the rest, who are adamant that the Bali paragraph must be kept. The US ambassador has been very clear there will be no compromise on the language on Ukraine. And on the other side, you have the Russian and Chinese position. And this is why people think that we have reached a point of impasse. In fact, an indication came from the Indian Sherpa, Mr. Amitabh Kant, who said in an interview yesterday to the Hindu, in fact, that we are fully confident of consensus on all developmental issues, which means essentially that the geopolitical issue is a problem. It is a concern for both sides. If there is no joint statement, as Gautam put it, maybe nothing much hangs on it, because it's not something countries are mandated to do. It is their statements of intention. But remember, in all of these years, the G20 has never walked away without putting a joint leaders declaration together. So if they don't have a statement this time, this will be the first time ever. And that puts a question not only on India's G20 presidency, but it puts a question, as you were saying earlier, on the future of the G20 itself. Yes. If they're not able to put together a consensus, then what does it mean for this economic body that has so far been the predominant body for the world at a time when, of course, the question of multipolarity is up there? So I do think that the question over whether there's a leaders' declaration, a joint communique, a joint statement from the leadership there or not is important from that point of view. Otherwise, of course, the statements itself on the other issues of economics, of climate financing, on multilateral institutions and the reform of those institutions, on what should be done with the WTO, those are also incredibly important.
Yeah, those are important. Perhaps something will come through them. Maybe there will be some sort of a breakthrough. But this is the reality of our times. This is the reality of our times that we definitely do have to keep in mind. On that note, I want to thank all of you for joining us on the India Development Debate this evening. And just a quick word for all of our viewers. This is the last time I will be presenting the India Development Debate. I want to thank all of our viewers who've stayed with us over the last several years. This is a show close to my heart, one that traverses the cross-section of economics, policy, business, and what these important issues mean to all of us. I want to thank you for your trust in me. Thank you.